So, what did your sex education look like? Who taught you the facts about your body, sex, and gender? Welcome, GynoCurious listeners. This is your host, Dr. Amy Novat. We are here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please give us your feedback. Send us your questions to comments at radiofreerhinecliffe.org or gynocurious@gmail.com. Please see us on Facebook and Instagram. Follow us, star, and comment. We love to hear from you. So, I wanted to further explore ways in which sexual education happens in our country. We have discussed this with others on GynoCurious, but I was especially grateful to hear from our next guest, Mystkue Woods. Mystkue is a sexuality arts educator and consultant based in Philadelphia, PA. She's the CEO of Mystkue Publications, an organization focused on the innovation of expressive arts and sexuality for marginalized communities. She specializes in integrating the expressive art modalities of poetry, dance, music, drama, storytelling, and creative movement to promote positive attitudes towards sexual and reproductive wellness across cultures and communities. Welcome, Mystkue. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I just love the way you have described the work that you're doing. So, often I'll start these conversations with just asking, like, how did you get here? What is the arc of your professional life, if you will, that got you to this fantastic work that you're doing?
Yes, so I've always been an arts person. So since I was about two, I've been indulging in the performing and visual arts. And so I started off in dance and I did dance for a majority of my life up until I was about 17. But also I had spurts where I was doing vocal and playing instruments. And then later on, probably when I was in about sixth or seventh grade, I started to write and I fell in love with writing and I became a poet. And then from there, I was just like, okay, so I'm always writing about love and relationships. And then as I got to high school and then into college, my peers will always talk to me about their love and relationships. And then one day I was sitting in a student government office and my friend was like, hey, you should be a sexologist. And I was like, what is that? And they were like, well, basically you can be a doctor and, talk to people about relationships and love and sex and all those things. And I was like, what? I can do that. And so I did some research and I said, I feel like sex is always going to be a hot topic because everybody has opinions about it and different capacities to it. But what would make me different from everyone else? And I was like, well, I don't see a lot of people doing like anything with sexuality and art and music. And we hear it so much, right? We see it every day. And so I was like, how can I teach concepts about sexuality through an artistic lens? And so that is how I got here.
Oh, I love it. And I have so many questions. First, I just love the idea that as you aged and came into your own being, that you were clearly someone who was receiving and open to talking to others because everybody wanted to talk to you about their love life. And that's not common, More often people will just remain silent and
Mhm.
not share, but you clearly were so open to it. So I applaud you for that, for being kind of, if you will, the receiver of those stories. Yeah. And clearly you were doing it without judgment because people continue to reinforce that part of you. I always love learning about how people come to do what they're doing because it's often this, I don't know, the word I use is like crystallization.
Mhm.
This coming together of who we are and all these what feel initially as like disparate parts, dance, music, and then sex. If we break it down, we might say, oh, wait, sex is in everything, right? Who we are and our sexual beings is in everything. But the way you integrated it and it kind of came to be in your profession is kind of a beautiful thing. Yeah. So can you talk to me so yes, the expressive arts is used by others to talk about sex and sexual education, but I have a feeling you do it in a very unique way. Can you unpack that for us and tell us how that works for you?
Yeah, I think that when you think of sexuality and arts, most people think of embodiment, right? And so there's definitely embodiment in my work, but we go a little bit deeper than that. So I started off with my In Between the Lines course, which is really about erotic writing and thinking about what eroticism is and how that relates back to your sexual development. And so everything is grounded in research, right? And so I had a professor, Dr. Gilbert, who had just released their book called Black and Sexy, a radicalized framework in sexuality. And so essentially, she developed what she described as a DJ kind of scale where you see that the volume and the levels are going up when you are in a studio booth and you can see that. And so that's basically how she explained the 8 channels of sexuality and 8 channels of sexiness, excuse me. And so when I first heard it, I was like, wow, like this is interesting. So how in which the way our bodies and our sexuality really rims, how does that play in our level of eroticism, right? And like what do we define as erotic and how are different elements of us aroused when maybe it's not just our mind or our body or our heart or our spirits, right? And what does that look like? And so when we take that and when we add writing to it, it becomes this beautiful nuance of there's no right answer. And I think oftentimes in life, there's a lot of things that come across as, oh, this has to be right or wrong. But I think that the beauty in erotic writing and being able to figure out who you are is that it has its own personal story for each person who gets to write. And that is because we're all different. And even though we might have similar things that have happened or that have occurred, there's still some sense of uniqueness to it. And so being able to really step into that level of embodiment from a writing perspective, but also thinking about how when you are writing, it gets to release into different components of your body is really interesting as well.
Do you think that through writing, people are able to express more about, again, the varied experiences they've had around sex and sexuality in a way that when they have to speak about it, they're more feeling more repressed or fearful of expressing it?
Yes, I think that writing allows for people to just kind of get it out of their head and out of their bodies. And I think that sometimes the fear about speaking it is like making sure that they say it politically correct and making sure that they say it in a way that is not misconstrued because we are policed in so many ways about how in which we come about in this world. The thing about writing is that, yes, it can be interpreted in any way, shape, or form, depending on who's reading it. But oftentimes when we talk about writing, specifically creative writing, it has the nuance of it is what the author wanted it to be. And so there's no one that can say, oh, it's supposed to be like this or it's supposed to look like that because it's genuinely what the author wanted it to be.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, because it does allow such personal expression, and one doesn't have to be, as you put it, right or wrong, or even great or bad. That the writing is your expressive uh, point of view, and it feels. I guess if I were one of your students, it feels safer. It just feels
Mhm.
safer, and so much about the conversation around sex and gender and our bodies feels so unsafe, particularly for women, whether you're cis, trans, or non-binary. There's been so much shaming, so much violence, so many isms
Mhm.
around it that it's I think it's scary for all of us to a different degree, of course, for us as individuals, but there's been so much shaming about talking about sex.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the 8 channels of sexiness. Can you just tell us what those channels are? I'm so curious.
Oh, you're
We
putting
don't
me
have
on
to do,
the spot here. Let me
yeah,
see.
but just give us some examples. It doesn't have to be all 8 of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so one is comportment.
Hmm.
Oh, it's been a minute since I taught this class. Now I'm trying to think.
I'm sorry.
No, it's off. It's fine. It's fine. I'm trying to put them. Performative blackness is one.
Hmm.
I'm trying to put them in order. How I remember them. Comportment, performative blackness.
So these are ways in which we might speak about sexy time or sexiness.
Mhm.
Yeah, I get it. I didn't know if channels was like a physical phenomenon
No.
or
So essentially, the book is talking about how each of these elements show up in our sexuality development and
Oh,
how when we think about them, there's different nuances, right? And so performative Blackness is one that always sticks out because we as individuals, or even thinking outside of that, thinking about society in general, when we think about celebrities, right, we often put them on this pedestal and it's like, oh, they can't do any wrong. It's, oh my goodness, they've done this and they've done that. And so sometimes when we see them in relationships, we are following their relationships as if they're our close friends, right? And so we're disappointed, or we build these opinions about them and we kind of put them on these markers. So like one of the examples we're always given are Obama and Michelle, right? And so everyone's like, oh, like this is the staple, relationship, and we want to be just like them. And sometimes it takes away the realism of like, it's work, right? It's not just cookie cutter. It's not just put together all, in a way that makes it unrealistic, right? So
mm,
people will fantasize and they make it that it's very like, oh, everything is awesome and it's just put together. But in reality, the work in which, those two individuals have put into their relationship is a lot on top of being, in the public eye. And so what does that look like? And so it really challenges that. And it also talks about, the different cultural appropriation that often happens when we talk about AAVE, which is, African American Vernacular English, and what that looks like and how culturally it has changed and been nuanced into what relationships are.
it really strikes me that, when I was a kid and learning about sex,
Mm,
it was the physical education teacher who taught me everything, at that time. This guy knew nothing. He knew nothing about sexual ed, but for whatever reason, he was told that he had to teach this. And all he really taught was about how to fear sex, how to fear STIs. It was all about basically creating so much fear that he thought we might not indulge, which of course we know does not work. So, do you know if offhand that still exists in school systems where, you got some teacher who has really never been taught anything about sex ed is teaching about sex ed?
yes, it's still happening. In fact, I just spent on Friday, so 2 days ago, I went to my high school's career day, and it was just, talking about what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm a sex educator, I'm a community health worker, amongst other things. And so I didn't know this, but there was another adult in the room with me and another guest speaker. And during the time that we were having the conversation with the students, it seemed as though the adult was engaging with me. I was talking to the students. They were really like quiet and kind of shy. They didn't want to talk. And so afterwards, in reflection, I realized why, because there was like this power dynamic in there. And they were like, well, I don't want to say anything that could possibly get me in trouble, because come to find out, the adults happened to be their vice principal. And so in
Mm.
there, they had made a statement that they review the health department or the health curriculum that is given to the students. And so the students were like, yeah, but we don't learn anything. It's 2 weeks long. And I was like, yeah, I recall seeing it. It's 2 weeks long. There's no way that I can teach half the topics that I teach in 2 weeks. That's just brushing the surface. And so they were like, yeah, well, I approve it. And, they talk about HIV and they talk about abstinence only. And I was like, right. And those things are and can be important. And, but let's moving away from just the abstinence only, because at this rate, we know the levels of HIV and how in which um, they are rising, but specifically for ages 13 to 24. And so instead of moving in a way of like, oh, we're only going to talk about abstinence, let's talk about what the safer sex practices look like, because we know that the youth are having it. And so I thought the conversation went great. And then later on, come to find out that I had offended the assistant principal and that they did not want me to talk anymore to the rest of the students for the rest of the sessions, because they felt as though I was getting too much into the sex ed. And so we see this level of shame being brought about, but also to this idea of like, oh, let's just hide it or brush it under the rug and maybe it'll go away. And inevitably, the answer is that it's not going away, right? So people are always going to have sex and talk about sex. And even in my explanation, I said, when I talk about sex, I'm not innately just talking about penis and vagina, right? Or, intercourse in that way. I'm talking about so many different elements. So your orientation, who you are attracted to, who you are as a being, how have you come to know who you are, what your name means. And then even more deeper than that, thinking about like what feels good for you. And it was so interesting to have a individual sitting in there who's in somewhat in control of what these kids are taking in. And they were so appalled by the fact that I was having this conversation. I was just like, well, I mean, this makes my job fun, but also too, because I feel like I am a disruptor of, the status quo, if you will, or what should and should not be done. And so in one aspect, I was like, oh, well, I just made you upset and I just pissed you off. And that means I've done my job. But also, thinking from a career aspect, I have to be very careful, right? Because if I do that and I piss the wrong person off, that could be really detrimental to my career. And so I don't want to do that. So it's
It's
like,
exhausting.
it's
It's
very much so.
exhausting. The
Very much.
censorship that still exists, the expectations around what is right and wrong. And what drives me out of my mind is, we're in a country that often talks about the value of science
Mhm.
and we have so much science. We have so much fact that demonstrates that good, thorough, robust sex education doesn't promote sex in young people. It might promote sex with safety, education, consensuality. And,
Mhm.
it's the same conversation around abortion that if you don't talk about abortion, doesn't mean that people aren't going to have abortions. They are. And we
Yep.
know this. So the fact that no one is willing to look at the science around this and that all these other points of view are threatened by the facts and they do so much to try to censor it is really, it's obvious, but I it still inflames me. Oh, yeah, so I respect how hard that must have been. And I'm thinking about the students who you were speaking to, and I can imagine there were multiple in that classroom who were just saying, "Oh, thank goodness there's someone who's speaking to us like, who's respecting us, who knows us, who wants to give us right information." And yet there's this other figurehead who's you know, just
Yeah.
creating boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that the school that I went to has a lot of traditions. And so oftentimes when people talk about the school, they're like, oh, yes, like, so there's rave reviews about how in which we do things. And so as an alumni, we actually have that relationship with the younger individuals going into the school and who are currently there to be able to speak to them in ways that, can really empower them to be the best leaders or whatever it is that they choose to be in life. And so I think that when you have, again, that level of power and you also are not a part of that community because you did not go to the school, it does create a barrier and it also creates this like power dynamic because it's like, oh, you have the power to shut it down or whatever case may be, but also you're taking away from this relationship that has been built over 175 years.
I have no problem with a leader having some communication around the boundaries concerning mentorship. You know, maybe, oh, listen, you don't take them there, but you take them here. Some guidelines, some
Mhm.
parameters. But if it feels like it's actually breaching some level of I don't know, the culture of the school, the culture of the mentorship, the honesty, integrity of that relationship, which, oh boy, we are missing so much of in this country, right? It really, it's such a shame. It's such a shame. Yeah. Are the people that you're speaking to teaching always kind of the youth, young people, or are you teaching adults? Who is your audience?
My audience is mostly 13 to 24.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting age range because they're
Yeah.
in very different developmental places and
Mhm.
experiential places.
Mhm.
Do you find that sometimes you're speaking to a 21-year-old who might have the same, if you will, emotional intelligence or physical experience as the 13-year-old?
Absolutely. And vice
Yeah.
versa. I've also talked to some 13-year-olds who have, in my opinion, have experienced more than I have. And I'm like, okay, you know, this is great. Let's talk about it. Let's walk through, your journey. And again, I treat all of my students as individuals and I allow them to bring their uniqueness and their individuality to the classroom because it helps us to be able to shape our community as one while we're in that space together. But it also helps us to look at how everyone brings something to the table, right? And so when we think about culture, we have to be very intentional about what that looks like for our students because just they see so much and oftentimes it's like, oh, well, they're the 13 to 24 is that age bracket where they're trying to figure out who they are, where they fit in, and all of that. And so if we give them this piece that is like one size fits all, it really eliminates and isolates a lot of individuals from feeling like they can fit in. And so I allow the spaces that I curate with these students to be whatever they want it to be. I don't come in with the mindset of, oh, I know everything, so this is how it's going to be. I ask them, hey, what is it that you're trying to get out of these sessions? What things do you already know that you want to build upon? What are some things that you don't know that you want to learn more about or you're curious about? And then leaving it for them to kind of guide me through. That way, it doesn't feel like, one, oh, here's this other course or thing that I have to go to that I'm not really interested in because no one really cares what I feel about it.
What you're describing is a mutual relationship, one that feeds the other and vice versa. And I know for me as a clinician, that's my greatest joy. That's where when a patient teaches me something and in return I can provide her with something, that's the gift of healing.
Yeah.
That's the gift of teaching. So I really I just want to honor that you're creating an environment that's saying, I'm here to learn. I hope you're here to learn. Let's teach each other without judgment, without shame. Nobody knows it all. And again, harking back to Michelle, the Obamas, like there's so much noise out there around what relationships should look like
Mhm.
or what sex should be or again, I didn't have the internet when I was growing up and learning about this stuff, and I can only imagine how kind of liberating it can be and yet how impactful, both negative and positive, it can be when you hear and see all of this imagery and all of this conversation. It's confusing.
Yeah, I say one of the superpowers that you have to have these days is being able to decipher through the mess because there
Mm,
is a lot of mess and there's a lot of gems. There's
yeah.
I think that I've seen two different components where I've had educators who are still teaching me because I'm still in school. I'm a lifelong learner, right? And so one of the things that I find is you'll have some professors who are like, hey, use the internet as your oyster, and go out and find these great things that you can bring back to your class and that you can use, right? And then in the other capacity, you have individuals who are like, no, if it's not from 1985, then you shouldn't be using it because they're, very drawn to the foundational work that has been, laid, which is great in some components, but also too, things change, right? And the world has become even more interesting than it was, 50 years ago, 25 years ago. And so being able to speak to where we are now sometimes does lead for us to look at things in a different perspective. And it's interesting. So being able
Absolutely.
to kind of mesh both of those together and figure out what works, I really believe it's the best for students to be able to figure it out on their own.
How do you or maybe I don't know if you can one teach discernment? Can one teach a student how to, go through the morass
Mhm.
and and I'm tempted to say, find truth from fiction, but I have a trouble with those. I don't think anything is only truth. And, so how do you help people get through the noise?
I think so. I always say follow your gut, right? Because your
Mm,
gut will always tell you, like, something about this just doesn't seem,
I hear ya.
right. But also, too, I tell them to look at, again, their cultural background, their experiences, their people who they trust, their experiences. And I don't tell them to necessarily go relive those experiences, right? But think about what are the nuances that are very similar and the ones that are different. And then those ones that are also really outliers, because the outliers will tell you, like, this doesn't seem really on track with everything else over here in this bucket that I have. And then we have like a few that are like, oh, okay, this is not the best output, but they have something, but maybe their delivery is off, right? And so if they're able to pull whatever the message is, whatever the thing that is meant to be taught out of it, but the delivery is off, or the delivery doesn't make sense, or it is what I like to say, living in the old way, they can still take the message, but they can recreate it so that it has a better way of landing for whatever audience they're going to be giving it to.
I love that you respect their gut. I think that again, we live in a culture that has been so disrespectful of teenagers,
Hmm.
and that there's always been this how do I put it? That teenagers are just impulsive and
Hmm.
don't know how to take care of themselves, and that you shouldn't allow them to entrust their instincts and intuitions, which is something I speak about a lot because I think particularly for folks who identify as female, we have been told far too long, your instincts aren't good. You got to follow what the man says. And I'm done with that. So empowering these young people to say, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is my brain kind of guiding me to? And then mingle it with the information that you're providing or that the internet is providing or what their cultural milieu is informing them about is just so respectful, and we owe it to them. We absolutely owe it to them. Yeah. So one of the things that I read about you is that you have this self-coined mantra, and I want you to speak to it and unpack it for us. What is
Yeah.
it?
No, the South Point mantra is sin, sex, sin. So it means sensuality, sexuality, sentiment. And that
Mm,
is just simply because I believe that all aspects of sexuality have those three components in them, but also too, we move about the way of the world with those three components, right? And so we have elements of us that are very sentiment, right? We have things that we hold on to that hold sentimental value to us. And so when I think about sentiment, I think about the emotions that come along with it. I think about how it can be very joyous, but it can also be very solemn, depending on what the experience was around whatever the item or moment or memory may be. Then I think of sexuality. I think again, it is developed in whatever capacity the individual wants to have it, right? So whether we are talking about the physicality of sex or we're talking about the nuances of gender and, orientation and just identity as a whole and expression. And then you have sentiment, right? Being able to one, hold what we find as sentiment to us, but also how do we produce sentiment to others, right? And keep a space where individuals can really dive into that. Because sometimes it might be that an individual has never felt a sense of sentiment towards them, right? And so they don't, if you've never experienced it, then you don't know how to give it to others. And so being able to open up a space where it is provided for them so that they can to go out into the world and be able to give it to someone else. So it's also really about reciprocity. And so when I thought about the three S's, it was really about how do they all reconnect. And so if you draw an S on a piece of paper, you see that it has a swiggly line. But if you really want to, you can connect the top end of the S
mm.
and the bottom end of the S together so that it becomes an everlasting, just realm of curves, if you will.
Infinity. That
Mhm.
there's an infinity of learning, there's an infinity of exploration, there's an infinity of sentimentality. And It's such a beautiful, beautiful image and way of looking at the world. And you've said a couple things I just want to remark on. First of all, sentimental is not a word you hear young people use or talk about. It almost feels, I guess I'd say, old fashioned, but it's
Mhm.
so much a part of our human experience, isn't it? It's woven into, for at least for me, it's woven into ritual, it's woven into experience, it's woven into the events in my life that have made me, well, both feel good and not so good and kind of differentiating between the two. So I really, I just so love that you've, included that in that infinity. And the other thing that you've now spoken about a couple of times is when we talk about sex, or at least in my experience, when I talk to others about sex and gender and intimacy, we're not just talking about what goes on in the bedroom. We're talking about relationship with maybe your lover, but maybe also your friend or the people in your life, that this is a way of being
Mhm.
in this very global way. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I also think that what's most important is your relationship with yourself,
Ah, right on. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so being able to speak to, here's who I am and how I define whatever definition I want to come up with, right? So you ask me a question, this is how I'm going to answer it. And it comes from this way of life. And because I've had X, Y, and Z experiences, right? And being able to stand in that and be okay with the fact that my definition might not be the same as someone else's. But how do I make that into a space where one, I can stand in it and I can be proud of it, but also I can move about in the world and possibly teach someone else about it and also learn from their experiences too.
So many of my colleagues need to sit in a room with you. So I hope one day you're teaching physicians and nurse practitioners and PAs, because it's astonishing and embarrassing for me how many OBGYNs don't talk about sex in the office. I mean, there have been studies done by ISWISH that say like 20%, 30% of OBGYNs will mention sex in the office. And if you aren't going to talk to the person who's looking in your vagina about sex, like, where do you
Yeah.
go? Where do you go?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
so recently I've been talking more to physicians and doctors because I started a prep campaign. And so I talked to them about their biases around prescribing PrEP, specifically to cisgender women. And then, of course, because there's also a racial component in that too. What does that look like for BIPOC people?
Would you just explain what PrEP is? Because some of our audience may not know what that is,
Yeah,
please.
of course.
Yeah.
So PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. Essentially, it is a pill and or an injectable shot that can be taken to prevent the transmission of HIV.
And should all comers use it? Who would you recommend might look into that for their well being?
Absolutely. I think that anyone who is having sex, doesn't matter who they're having sex with, but if they have had sex with, according to the CDC, if they have had sex with a person with a penis in the last year, as well as a person with a vulva, then they should be considering being on PrEP. I think that anyone who is just looking for a way to just have another component to their sexual health toolkit to be able to keep them, protected and safe, then a PrEP is a good option for them. And I can't tell you anything but good things about it. But, people are always saying like, well, what are the, long-term ramifications and things of that nature? And what I always say is right now, all of the studies that have been done are doing extremely well. It's 99% effective. However, I can't tell you what's going to happen 35 years from now, right? There might come out and then there might be this crazy commercial that says like, you might be entitled to compensation, right? I don't know. And so I like to keep that open for individuals who are like, well, I have concerns. I understand your concerns, but as of right now, it seems to be the thing that is keeping us healthy and keeping us, giving us some type of hope, right? Because there was a lot of time where individuals felt like, oh, if they contracted HIV, then they, wouldn't be able to live. And so that is just simply not true, right? So you have ART, which is, antiretroviral therapy, which helps individuals who do have the virus be able to keep their viral load down, and so that the virus doesn't, spread and then transition into AIDS. And then you have PrEP, which is, just keeping you safe if you are a person that is HIV negative, so that you won't transmit it, and that you can still, if you decide to want to go have sex with an individual who may be living with the virus, you all can still live a happy, healthy sexual life, and you won't put yourself at risk.
Yeah. So for anyone out there listening who says, gosh, I wonder what this looks like, maybe how do I resource it? I guess I would just say look into Planned Parenthood, ask your gynecologist. There may be a public health organization in your town or city that provides information and the medication. Is there any other place, Miss Ewa, that I've forgot that they should know about?
Yeah, so depending on where you live, you can go and Google something called an NPIN. So it's N as in Nancy, PIN. And so essentially what the NPIN does is it will allow you to locate areas where you can get PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, PEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis. So hypothetically, if you feel like you have been in contact with someone that has tested positive for the virus, you can take that medication and you can take it for 30 days, and it will basically support you in ensuring that you don't also test positive for the virus. However, you only have 3 days to get on the medication. And so it is really important that if you come into contact with it, you immediately and go and get on PEP. And it also tells you where you can get condoms, and as well as any other thing so that you would need in your sexual health journey. And so what it does is so say you live in, I don't know, Colorado, right? And you're like, I don't really know anywhere. So you type in your zip code and then you'll say if you want to go 5 miles or 10 miles or 25 miles, and it'll give you all of the locations where you can go get these things from, even if it's just like, oh, I want to get an HIV test, right? It'll tell you where to go to be able to get them. It'll also tell you what kind of insurance they take. If they take in just general walk-ins, if they are on a sliding scale. So if it is a person who has a fixed income and needs to, pay just a certain amount, they will let you know that. And then it'll also tell you what kind of people in the community they service, right? So are they servicing college students? Are they servicing youth, young mothers, or whatever the case may be? And that is really important because you want to go somewhere where you feel comfortable and you don't feel like you're an outsider. But also, too, it'll help you to be able to decide, like, oh, do I want to go somewhere that's in my community? Because there's stigma around that, right? So people say, like, oh, I don't want to go to somewhere that's close to me because I don't want anybody to see, right? And we're trying to get out of that, right? It's important to be able to go and get yourself checked out so that you can be in the know, and there shouldn't be any shame around that. But some people are still, nervous about it, and so they opt to go a little bit further out so that they can get the help that they need.
Yeah, information is power. And everyone listening, please, knowing your well being, your health, your risks, all these things are a way of empowering you, your partners, and your community. But yeah, unfortunately, there still is so much stigma. Mystique, we can also add that tag, to this episode so people can take a look at that. So coming to a close, and I just wanted to hear, how do you use like dance and music and incorporate these other expressive arts into the learning? Can you describe what that might look like?
Yes. So typically, depending on what I'm teaching, so next week I'll be teaching a course on HIV 101, just giving them the basics. And so one of the materials that they have to do is they have to be able to come up with a chant to be able to describe what they learned in the class for the day. And so I usually split them up into groups, and I say, you could take any song that you want to take that you really, really like, and here's your topic. So the topic might be PrEP, or it might be HIV, or it might be STIs. And so they have to then take that and turn it into a chant and be able to perform it. And so I usually tell them, like, if I wanted to put you on a commercial, what would your commercial look like? And so this allows them, one, to be creative, but two, also to be able to tell me what is it that they learned? And then also too, as an educator, what do I need to go back on and speak about again? So to make sure that they got the facts straight.
I so wish you were my teacher when I was 13 and 15 and 18. Gosh, there just was nothing available. So I'm so grateful to your community, for your community that you're doing the work that you do because it just sounds so incredible. So you mentioned the kind of the obstacle. We talked a little bit about the censorship. Is there anything else that's kind of truly been an obstacle in the work that you do?
I think it's about getting people to just show up because you have to think about it, right? There's a lot of different things that are marketed to our youth, right? Specifically our youth. And they want to go to the things that seem fun, that seem energizing, right? And sometimes talking about sex, just the topic itself, for some, it's like really exciting, but for others, it's really cringy. They feel, embarrassed or they're like, this is awkward. And so getting them to show up, but when they really realize that this is about bettering themselves and keeping themselves, educated and safe and protected, depending on where they are in their level of maturity, they may be ready to take on that. But most of them are, kind of in this incubation stage where they're like, oh, I want to explore. I want to figure it out on my own. And it's like, great, we want you to figure it out on your own, but we want you to do so in a way that you are well informed. Right. And so sometimes it's about meeting them where they are. And that might mean that I have to go out and I have to, find them at a carnival or, they're on these apps. And so I have to get on TikTok and I have to get on, the dating apps that they're using. And that is the way that I disperse the information because I have to reach them where I can because I might not be able to actually get them to come and sit in a classroom, right? Because that takes buy-in and being able to understand that.
Right. The blackboard is so not the only way we teach these days. There's all these other venues and formats, if you will. So, um, yeah, again, that's so respectful of these young people, and I think it's great. And I wish that this kind of education existed throughout the world. Yeah. So, as we close, I like to ask people when you're not working, what gives you pleasure? What gives you joy? How do you carve that space out for yourself? Because we all work so much.
So when I'm not working, I'm usually reading or I'm dancing.
Oh,
If
yay.
I'm not dancing, because lately it's been harder to get back into the dance room. If I'm not doing those things, I'm usually always writing. Because even though I do a lot of writing and stuff for the work, it is something about being able to just write freely and pick a random topic and create something from it. Or I'm doing like little arts and crafts or stuff like that. And I love driving. I will drive basically anywhere. I've driven almost halfway across the county just because, like, why not? Let's just drive.
Is it just we got to talk about that. So is that like just kind of seeing the world pass by? Is it can you speak a little bit more about that because it's so interesting. I don't love driving. I love being a passenger and going on these journeys.
I think I think it's a little bit of both, right? So there's this like anticipation of, oh, like when am I going to get to this next destination and being able to see the nuances of what happens in between, like if I'm stopping from one space and going to another. But I also think I get lost in the car in terms of like listening to music and being really just into just a jam session, if you will, in the car on my way there. And that just brings me joy.
Yeah, I call it the liminal space where I'm almost don't know how do I get from there to there, but I've been in the car, all's well, no accidents, nothing. But this zone that is so it's so refreshing and amorphous, and I think it's really healing. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have anything else that you think that we should speak about that the audience might be saying, she didn't mention that? Anything else you think that people would want to know?
I would say for anyone who is listening to always practice your self advocacy in terms of your sexual health and just you in general. I think that is the most important thing. And that is what I try to instill in my students, but also to anyone that I talk to. Because if you don't advocate for yourselves, then no one else will.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful for your time and your expertise and your beautiful work. It just sounds so transformative. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And thank you to Jen Hammoud and Maddie Rosenberg, who helped me produce this show. Please, until the next episode, stay well and listen to your instincts and intuitions. They are the greatest of teachers, not to be ignored.